Hi, we're at the Hot Springs Mammoth site, which is very unique in a number of ways. So we're going to talk about the bones that you can see behind me, but I want to tell you the story about what happened, and we have to scroll the clock back of geologic time, literally hundreds of millions of years ago. I mean hundreds of millions of years ago, like to 300 and some odd million years ago, back when this area was covered with a sea, an ocean, during one of the transgressive sequences that covered North America. In doing so, it laid down a lot of limestone. And millions and millions of years later, the whole area got uplifted because of the laramide orogeny, which is a shallow subduction zone that comes in at about 10 degrees or less under the North American continent. And that uplifted the Rockies much further inland than a typical mountain range, and also caused the South Dakota Black Hills, this is where we are now, to begin to uplift. So weathering and erosion kind of let a lot of the younger layers get eroded off, and groundwater that came in through fractures of the limestone that had been cracked from the uplift carried acidic water, basically carbonic acid, and that began to eat away the fabric of the limestone. Now, that began to create a sinkhole, and that sinkhole was formed and warm water came up to the surface, creating a pond. So if you can imagine that in the cold winters back here in about 190,000 years, so if you look at the bone bed down here, you'll see a kind of stratigraphic unit there showing you the depth of approximately 25 feet of sediment's been removed, starting at the 190,000 year mark, or down to the 190,000 year mark, up to the 140,000 year mark. So why is this bone bed even captured here? Because the sinkhole we just showed you where the spring conduit area came in, and that's where the groundwater that was warm filtered up to the surface. And as it did, you have to imagine Ice Age animals, everything from little rodents like rabbits that we have today, prairie dogs, pronghorn, just a number of animals that we still have existing, and then megafauna and other extinct Pleistocene age, last Ice Age mammals came to have a bite here and to get some water. Because grasses grew around the edge of the warm sinkhole, and when they leaned over, the hypothesis is that they slipped in because there was mud of a certain rock layer that surrounded the edge of the sinkhole, and it became slippery. And they fell in and likely died because they couldn't get out, or maybe even they drowned. So you might wonder, why are the bones inside under shelter? This is called an in situ shelter. It is climate controlled, and that's super important, because the climate control helps keep these bones from deteriorating. The scientists have actually added some preservative to these bones and binact them, which is a type of glue, to keep them from deteriorating any more than they already have, because these bones are not necessarily permineralized like many fossils are. There are so many fossils that have been embedded in here. There are approximately 80 mammoths here, and many other critters that have been saved into this rock layer. There's at least 80 mammoth skeletons here, but they're not just Columbian mammoths. They're also woolly mammoths. But I'm going to show you a couple of Columbian mammoths that are important to this particular bone bed. So I'm going to have you look at our lovely Napoleon, which is marked as number 14. Kind of sits about maybe 7 to 10 feet above the base of the bone bed. And I want you to look at his tusk, and he's one of the best complete skulls that's found here at the Mammoth site in Hot Springs. Something about tusk and teeth for mammoth species. Just like elephants today, mammoths actually have growth rings associated with their tusk. So you have bigger rings, that typically means they had better food resources to eat. Smaller rings, more challenging. Interesting enough, you can tell when a female is actually lactating because they'll have a discoloration to their rings and their tusk. Each mammoth gets 6 sets of teeth, and we can gauge the age of a mammoth based on their teeth. And every mammoth gets 4 teeth at one time, but they're like a conveyor belt. They get one on the upper jaw, like the upper left jaw, the upper right jaw, the lower left jaw, and the lower right jaw. And they're pushed out much like you would see a conveyor belt and literally peel off a piece at a time. And so when you look at this bone bed where 13 and 17 is, that is a very good look at the true size of bones when you're talking about something of the magnitude of a Columbian mammoth, especially the bulls that can get literally so tall in feet. And you look at these fully adult males and they've come here and they've either drowned or they just died because they couldn't get out. And that's the sad story for so many of these animals that are here. And again, it's not just mammoths that are caught in this bed. There's a number of other smaller species and other Ice Age animals that were here. But you have to think that most of these animals started dying here somewhere around 130-ish thousand years ago, maybe even further back to 140,000 years. So a repeat cycle of literally thousands of years of animals coming to the same place, which was a hot springs, a sinkhole, and fell to the same fate. So we're at the bottom of the bone bed, and I might note that the bottom is right above the 190,000 year marker. So we're going to focus in on the jumble amount of mammoth fossils down here at the base. And I'm going to talk about why that's so significant. When you get articulated bones, articulated refers to bones that are still in the position, in other words, how they were when the animal was alive. So you have articulated bones, and that would mean that your bones are connected and like one vertebrae after the other. And if you look at this mammoth right here, you can see that its vertebrae are still together. So let's say we find a random vertebrae that's been separated. That would not be articulated. You can see how some of these bones are completely separated, like big, maybe femur bones, leg bones, scapulas, which would be shoulder bones, those kinds of things. They're not all together. They're not all connected, so they're disarticulated. Clearly, this is probably one animal or two that you have here. But you can see that you could easily have some of the fossils that could be not present or easily matched up. The cool thing about the sinkhole is that most of the bones got preserved. Unlike bones that are at the surface on land, scavengers, other sources of maybe water could pick them up and move them. So what you're looking at is a living assemblage of fossils where their bones are where they died. And they haven't been transported a great distance. In other words, they're right where they were when they died. So that's the difference between a living fossil assemblage and a dead fossil assemblage. Most fossils are dead assemblages, where we just find bits and pieces here or there. And instead, we're finding animals, and big sections of animals, in this layer that spans literally 50,000 years. So at this bottom of the bone bed, these are probably some of the first victims that actually fell into the sinkhole. And the further up you get towards the top of the layer, these are going to be some of your younger victims that fell to the same exact fate. So when you're looking at a fossil bed like this, scientists are trying to piece together what happened. They're not just looking at the bones, they're also looking at any plant fossils, the chemistry that we can find in the actual geologic rock material. All of that helps spell a story in terms of what was going on, what was the climate like, what led to this awful fate for these animals who died here in this sinkhole. It's important to take note of the flat layers of rock because each one of these layers potentially holds fossils, includes. Maybe not every layer, but that's the purpose of digging, is to get the overburden off the layers that don't contain fossils and get down to the fossiliferous layer. That's why you have to be very intentional and cautious and meticulous in your work to get bones out of the ground safely without damaging them.
As you take a look out on the bed of bones, it's just huge. And you have to take in that these animals basically died the same way, repetitiously at the same location by falling into this sinkhole. What a bummer for them, but a great fossil discovery for us.
So we're here to talk about how fossils are excavated and the laborsome process by which they are collected and then preserved. And in this case, they cored, meaning they did a hollow stem auger drill or something like that, and cored down in through this sediment and figured out that it is at least 65 feet. So the stick right here is 66 feet, and there are bones throughout that entire section. You can see a replica of a Columbian mammoth and then an actual bones, and you can begin to get the sheer size scope of what we're talking about. So when you're looking at a dig site, there's intention to how a dig site is set up. Typically, paleontologists and diggers will grid a site by maybe a cubic centimeter or a cubic inch, and you can see one of those grids out there. And they will have buckets that you put the debris in of the rock that you excavate out, and then you remove that sediment, but don't throw it away because that sediment can contain microfossils. In addition, you would have hand tools such as shovels. You would have pneumatic tools, like there's like little small jackhammers, and you would have brushes, and everything is very intentional to try to reduce the potential for damaging bones. Because anything that is damaged or is lost takes away from the scientific value of the fossil bed and the whole story that went with it. Once you get the fossils out though, if you have to plaster jacket them and not leave them in place like you see at this in situ shelter, then you have to plaster them and take them to a lab. Having done that work, it is extremely tedious. Not just to jacket in the field, because that kind of preserves that whole encasement, like a cast on your arm or your leg, but you get it into a lab, you have to crack that open carefully and then literally remove each piece of sediment, and it is so time consuming. So I would say for every time you find a bone, multiply that at least by 10, and that's how long it takes just to clean up a bone, if not longer. So then you have to figure out how they all fit together. That's why actually having a gridded dig site like this matters, because that way you can totally figure out the spatial differentiation between each and every bone, not just vertically but laterally, because we care about which level of the bone bed that they were in for their age, and then we also care about how those bones were positioned one next to the other. So I want to point out something important about the site. If you look over here into the corner, you're going to notice that the rock layers known as strata are fairly horizontal, and then all of a sudden they dip, which is the angle of inclination, suddenly. So that means likely that was the entrance to the sinkhole. So there are lots of bones found on the outside of the sinkhole, and usually they're sporadic. So there would be death assemblages where you just have a bone here or there, maybe scavengers picked it up, meaning other animals, or they got washed away in a storm, and some might have been washed into the actual bone bed, meaning into the sinkhole. But that is an important thing to recognize, that the dip is important to interpreting part of the story. As we continue our journey of looking at these bones, you're seeing some teeth sticking out, and a full adult size mammoth will typically have teeth that are about shoebox size. And they kind of look like a deck of cards, and you can see a good look at that where that conveyor belt just allows one section to fall off at a time as the new growth of the tooth comes behind it. So in other words, they don't lose one tooth all at once. Unless, let's say two bulls got in a fight and one knocked a tooth out of the jaw of its rival. That could be catastrophic for any type of elephant species, because they only get those 6 sets of teeth, and if they're missing their molar grinders, that can be very detrimental for them being able to have a healthy diet. They wear down these teeth pretty fast because they're eating grass predominantly. Certainly we think they may have had other things in their diet, but grass seems to be the primary thing, and that tends to be high in silica, which wears down those teeth. It'd be like you eating sand every single day. There is even some fossils in this bone bed of a short-faced bear, which is a very large predator of its time. There's a replica down there now. So I'm going to focus in on what looks like a rib cage and a skeleton of a backbone of a mammoth here. And that's a good example of articulation, where the fossils are still in the position which they would be connected to the body part that they join up with. And when we find articulated fossils, that is such a home run, because you get so much more information about truly the size and how these animals, even the position in which they died. So this is a really special site because of the voluminous amount of fossils that are here, the just sheer number of mammoths, both Columbian and a few of the woolly mammoths. Woolies were actually smaller than Columbian mammoths. But how does this site differ from the Waco mammoth site? That's a national monument. Well, the mammoth site there in Waco, Texas, is actually a nursery herd. And that is like one of the very few in the nation and world that have been found of Columbian mammoths. But this site, in its just own right, is absolutely remarkable for the sheer number of fossils that have been preserved and the amount of both megafauna and small fauna, mega meaning large mammoths.
What are the primary takeaways from this site? First and foremost, the animals that came here met a similar fate. They either came to get water, to warm up by the hot springs, to eat some. Whether they slipped in, fell in, they instantaneously drowned, or it took a while, their fate was ultimately to die here. And now we have an accumulation of thousands of fossils, vertebrate fossils on top of that, which is rare in itself to find so many vertebrate fossils and clustered together. Another takeaway is that many of the bones are articulated, meaning they're still pieced together. That's indicative of a living assemblage. Not all, but most are. And when you see this, that's an important takeaway. The third item that I want you to leave with is that this site has been carefully excavated and preserved using an in situ shelter that's climate controlled to help these bones so they do not deteriorate any more than they already have. There's a handful of these in the United States, and Waco, Texas has one for the Columbian mammoth herd that exists there. This place totally rocks, and if you are in Hot Springs, South Dakota, or anywhere near it, I would put this as a half-day stop for sure, because it is a remarkable story about how Pleistocene fossils, meaning last ice age animals, lived back during that time frame. Sometimes we like to think that the Ice Age was just a big cold ice bucket. Not even in South Dakota was that always the case. But climate was different than it is today. So lots of lessons to be learned from this, but please remember that every fossil is valuable in the scheme of scientific interpretation. More to come. See you at the next stop. Bye.